The battlefield reeked of smoke and blood, the deafening echoes of gunfire fading into eerie silence. Sergeant Nathan Carter gritted his teeth, pressing his trembling hand against the gaping wound in his side. His vision blurred as his body threatened to collapse. Boots pounded the earth nearby. Someone was coming. But when he looked up and saw who it was, his jaw tightened with fury. A black medic knelt beside him, hands steady, eyes focused. "Don't touch me," Carter growled, shoving the man's hands away despite the searing pain. "You're bleeding out," the medic said, voice calm but firm. "If I don't stop it, you won't make it." Carter's face twisted in defiance. He had spent years fighting alongside soldiers who looked like him, men he trusted. He didn't need him, but the medic didn't flinch. He simply unzipped his kit, his movements precise. "You can hate me all you want," he muttered, rolling up his sleeves. "But that bullet in your gut doesn't care." Carter's breath came in ragged gasps, his limbs growing heavy. The world swayed. His pride told him to push the medic away again. His body, however, was already betraying him. And then, another sound. Not boots. Not voices. A low, distant click. The medic's head snapped up, eyes locking onto the dark silhouette creeping just beyond the smoke. He froze. Carter's pulse spiked. The adrenaline surged back to life. His hand inched toward his rifle, but the pain was unbearable. The medic didn't hesitate. His hand darted to Carter's shoulder, pressing him down. "Don't move," he whispered. Carter opened his mouth to argue, but before he could say a word, the medic reached for his own knife. And then, the shadow moved. The air around them seemed to tighten, the weight of an unseen danger pressing in from all sides. The silence was suffocating. A bead of sweat rolled down the medic's temple. Carter exhaled, his pride warring with his instincts. For the first time in his life, he realized his survival depended on the one man he swore he didn't need. The shadow in the smoke shifted again, slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking wounded prey. The medic's grip on his knife tightened, his breath steady despite the thick tension pressing in around them. Carter clenched his teeth, forcing himself to stay still, every nerve in his body screaming to move. His hand hovered near his rifle, but the medic shot him a sharp glance, eyes warning him against any sudden action. Then, another sound. A faint rustling, just ahead. Carter knew that sound. A weapon being raised. The medic exhaled sharply, shifting just enough to shield Carter's body with his own. His fingers twitched, as if preparing to spring. But Carter wasn't about to lie there and let someone fight his battle. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he reached for his sidearm, slow and careful, heart hammering in his chest. Footsteps. Closer this time. The medic didn't move. His muscles tensed, poised to react, waiting for the right moment. Carter could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears, the seconds stretching unbearably long. Then, a flash of movement. The medic lunged. Carter barely had time to register what was happening before the shadow in the smoke jerked backward with a grunt of pain. A knife struck its mark, but the fight wasn't over. A gunshot rang out. The medic gasped, stumbling back, hand clutching his shoulder. Carter's blood ran cold. His body screamed at him to move, to fight, but the searing pain in his gut held him down. He could only watch as the figure in the smoke steadied their aim, the barrel of a rifle trained directly on the medic. Time slowed. Carter's vision swam, but he forced his arm up, gripping his pistol with trembling fingers. He had one shot, one chance, and then the enemy fired. The crack of the rifle shot tore through the air. Carter barely had time to react before the medic dropped to one knee, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. Blood darkened his uniform where the bullet had grazed his arm, but he didn't go down. Instead, he lunged forward, tackling the enemy before they could fire again. A struggle erupted in the haze. The medic and the enemy soldier grappled, twisting in the dirt. Fists connected, the sounds of impact sharp and brutal. Carter forced himself to move, pain be damned. He pushed up on one elbow, raising his pistol with a shaky grip. He had a clear shot, but every muscle in his body hesitated. One wrong move, and he could hit the medic instead. The enemy soldier snarled, yanking a knife from his belt. Carter's heart slammed against his ribs as he saw the blade arc through the air, aiming straight for the medic's side. Adrenaline took over. Carter fired. The shot was deafening. The enemy soldier jerked, the knife slipping from his grasp as his body crumpled. For a moment, Silence swallowed the battlefield. Smoke curled around them, thick and suffocating. The medic staggered back, panting, his eyes wide with something between shock and relief. Carter exhaled sharply, his grip on the pistol loosening. Then, movement. More footsteps. They weren't alone. Carter's stomach twisted. He forced himself upright, ignoring the searing pain in his gut. The medic turned, scanning the smoke, his expression tightening. Shadows moved in the distance. 2, maybe 3 figures closing in fast. There was no time to think. No time to argue. The medic grabbed Carter's arm, hauling him up with surprising strength. "We have to move," he muttered, his voice urgent but steady. Carter nodded, his vision blurring at the edges. He didn't trust this man, had refused his help before, but right now, none of that mattered. Right now, this black medic was his only chance at survival. The medic barely had time to sling Carter's arm over his shoulder before the shadows in the smoke materialized into enemy soldiers. Shouts rang out, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire. Bullets ripped through the air, kicking up dirt and debris around them. Carter gritted his teeth, his legs threatening to buckle beneath him, but the medic didn't slow. He pulled Carter along with unwavering determination, weaving through the wreckage of the battlefield. The ground was uneven, littered with bodies and discarded weapons, each step a battle of its own. A bullet whizzed past, missing them by inches. The medic didn't flinch. He pushed forward, guiding them behind the rusted remains of an overturned truck. Carter collapsed against it, his breath ragged, blood seeping through his uniform. The medic pressed 2 fingers to Carter's neck, checking his pulse, then yanked open his medical pouch. "You're losing too much blood," he muttered, pulling out a bandage. His hands moved fast, securing the makeshift dressing over Carter's wound. Carter clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to shove him away. The pain was unbearable, but what twisted in his gut even more was the realization that this man, the one he had dismissed, the one he had refused help from, was now the only thing keeping him alive. Shouts grew louder. Footsteps pounded against the dirt, closing in. The medic's eyes flickered to the side, assessing their surroundings. "We can't stay here," he said. Carter let out a breathless chuckle. "You don't say." The medic didn't smile. His grip tightened around Carter's arm, his expression unreadable. "I need you to trust me." Carter hesitated. Trust. The word felt foreign in his mouth, especially now. But as the sound of enemy soldiers neared, he realized he had no choice. He gave a weak nod. Without another word, the medic braced himself, then dragged Carter up once more. They had seconds, maybe less, before they were seen. The enemy was hunting them, and if they didn't move now, neither of them would make it out alive. The medic pulled Carter into the shadows of the wreckage, his movements quick and deliberate. The weight of Carter's body slowed them down, but he refused to stop. Footsteps pounded closer, voices barking orders in a language neither of them understood. The enemy was spreading out, searching. Carter clenched his teeth, forcing himself to stay conscious. His vision blurred, the blood loss making his limbs heavy, but the sheer force of survival pushed him forward. He could feel the medic's grip tightening around his arm, steady and unyielding. A flashlight beam swept across the area, barely missing them. The medic yanked Carter down, pressing him against the cold metal of a destroyed vehicle. He placed a hand over Carter's mouth, his breathing controlled, his body tense. 2 enemy soldiers passed just feet away, rifles raised, scanning the wreckage. Carter could hear their breathing, the soft crunch of gravel beneath their boots. One of them paused, tilting his head as if sensing something. He muttered something to his partner, who turned, scanning the area again. Carter felt his pulse hammer against his skull. If they were found now, there was no fight left in him. The medic was unarmed. They would be executed on sight. The enemy soldier took a slow step forward. Carter's muscles locked, his mind screaming at him to move, but the medic didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his medical pouch and carefully pulled out a small metal object, a mirror. With steady hands, he angled it around the corner of the wreckage, just enough to see their pursuers without exposing themselves. The soldier took another step, his boot inches from Carter's outstretched leg. Then, in the distance, an explosion erupted. A wave of heat and dust surged through the air, shaking the ground beneath them. The enemy soldiers cursed, turning toward the source. Orders were shouted. Within seconds, they were moving away, their attention pulled by the chaos. The medic didn't wait. He gripped Carter and moved, half dragging, half carrying him through the wreckage, using the confusion to their advantage. Each step was agony, but Carter bit down on the pain, his body trembling. They reached a small, collapsed trench just as another round of gunfire lit up the battlefield. The medic lowered Carter into the dirt, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He grabbed his canteen, unscrewed it, and pressed it against Carter's lips. "Drink," he ordered. Carter hesitated, then took a small sip, the water cool against his dry throat. The medic exhaled, scanning their surroundings. "We're not safe yet." Carter's voice was hoarse. "You could have left me behind." The medic met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Not an option." Another explosion rocked the distance, followed by screams. The battle was far from over. They weren't out of this yet, and Carter wasn't sure if either of them would make it out alive. Carter's breathing was ragged, every inhale laced with pain. His wound pulsed with a dull, burning ache, but he forced himself to stay alert. The medic crouched beside him, his dark eyes scanning the battlefield like a predator searching for a way out. Every movement was controlled, deliberate. This man wasn't just a field medic. He was trained for more than just saving lives. Another round of gunfire cracked through the air, closer this time. The enemy was regrouping, sweeping through the wreckage with ruthless efficiency. Their voices carried over the chaos, sharp and urgent. They were looking for survivors. The medic shifted, checking Carter's wound again. His fingers pressed against the soaked bandages, his jaw tightening. He knew the bleeding wasn't slowing enough. "We need to move," he muttered, his voice low. "They're getting closer." Carter exhaled sharply, bracing himself. "Not sure how much moving I can do." "You don't have a choice." The medic glanced around, then reached for his pack. He pulled out a small vial and a syringe, his movements quick but careful. Carter's eyes narrowed. "What the hell is that?" "Something to keep you going." The medic tapped the syringe, then pressed the needle into Carter's arm before he could protest. A sharp sting, then a cold rush. Within seconds, Carter felt a strange clarity creeping through his body, the pain dulling just enough to make movement possible. Distant shouts echoed through the wreckage. The enemy was closing in. The medic grabbed Carter's arm. "On 3, we run." "No stopping." Carter clenched his jaw. "Run? You sure about that? Would you rather die here?" Carter didn't answer. He gritted his teeth, nodding instead. 1. The voices grew louder. 2. Footsteps pounded against the ground, coming straight for them. 3. The medic yanked Carter up, and pain shot through his side, nearly sending him crashing back down. But the adrenaline, whatever the medic had injected into him, kicked in fast. He forced his legs to move, staggering forward as they sprinted from the trench, ducking low behind the remains of a collapsed building. Bullets whizzed past them, striking metal and stone. Someone shouted. They had been spotted. The medic grabbed Carter's arm again, dragging him through the rubble. They reached another barrier of debris, barely high enough for cover. The medic shoved Carter down, pressing him against the dirt. A flashlight beam flickered across the wreckage just ahead of them. The soldier holding it was close, too close. Carter's pulse pounded in his ears. The medic reached for his sidearm, his grip steady. The soldier's steps slowed. He was searching, listening. A second soldier joined him, rifle raised. Carter tensed, barely breathing. The medic's fingers hovered over the trigger. One wrong move, and they were dead. The two enemy soldiers stood just feet away, their boots crunching against shattered debris. One of them swept his rifle from side to side, his narrowed eyes scanning the darkness. The other held a flashlight, its beam cutting through the dust-filled air, inching dangerously close to where Carter and the medic were hiding. Carter could feel his pulse hammering in his throat. Every muscle in his body screamed in pain, but he forced himself to stay still. His fingers dug into the dirt, his breath barely escaping his lips. The medic was even quieter, his body motionless except for his steady hand gripping the pistol at his side. His breathing was controlled, his eyes locked onto the soldiers like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. A radio crackled. The soldier with the flashlight lifted it to his mouth. Nothing yet. Keep sweeping the area. Orders are to eliminate any survivors. Carter's jaw clenched. His body was already betraying him, sweat running down his temple despite the freezing night air. If they stayed here much longer, they were as good as dead. The soldier with the flashlight took a step forward. His boot knocked against a loose piece of metal, sending a sharp clatter through the silence. He froze, then slowly turned his head toward their hiding spot. Carter felt the medic shift ever so slightly, adjusting his grip on the pistol. If the soldier came any closer, they would have no choice but to fight. The flashlight beam hovered over the wreckage in front of them. A second more, and it would land directly on their position. Then, another voice called out from the distance. Found something. The two soldiers exchanged glances. The one with the flashlight hesitated, then lowered his weapon. "Let's move," he muttered. Carter barely held in his relief as the soldiers turned and jogged toward the source of the noise. The moment they were out of sight, the medic released his grip on the gun, exhaling quietly. "That was too close," Carter whispered. The medic didn't respond. His gaze followed the soldiers disappearing into the wreckage, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he reached down and helped Carter up again. "We have to keep moving," he said, his voice low. "They won't stay distracted for long." Carter grimaced as pain flared through his side, but he nodded. Whatever strength he had left, he would need it. The night was far from over. The night air was thick with the scent of burning metal and dust. Every step Carter took sent a sharp jolt of pain through his body, but he gritted his teeth and pushed forward. The medic moved swiftly, keeping low, his eyes scanning every shadow. There was no telling how many enemy soldiers were still out there. Ahead, the remains of a collapsed building stretched across the landscape, offering the only cover in the open terrain. The medic motioned for Carter to follow, quickening his pace. Carter stumbled slightly, his body protesting the movement, but he forced himself forward. Just as they reached the edge of the rubble, distant gunfire crackled through the air. Carter flinched, instinctively ducking. The medic grabbed his arm and pulled him into the shadows, pressing a hand against Carter's chest to keep him still. They listened. The gunfire wasn't aimed at them. It came from deeper within the ruined city, echoing through the empty streets. Shouts followed, orders being barked, men scrambling. The enemy had found someone. Carter exhaled slowly. "They're on to someone else." The medic nodded but didn't relax. His grip on his pistol tightened as he glanced toward a side alley. "That's not our problem. We keep moving." Carter swallowed the protest that rose in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to push back, to question why they weren't at least trying to signal their own squad, if there were any survivors left. But he knew the answer. There was no time, no guarantee. Right now, survival was all that mattered. The two of them crept along the alley, avoiding the main roads where the enemy patrols were sweeping. Every few feet, Carter could feel his strength slipping, his legs shaking under the strain of his injuries. The medic must have noticed because he suddenly stopped and turned toward him. "You're slowing down." Carter glared at him, breathing heavily. "No kidding." The medic glanced around, then crouched behind a broken-down vehicle, motioning for Carter to do the same. Carter followed, pressing his back against the cold metal as he tried to steady himself. "We can't keep going like this," the medic muttered. His gaze flickered toward Carter's wounds, his expression unreadable. Then, after a pause, he reached into his pack and pulled out a small vial and syringe. Carter tensed. "What the hell is that?" The medic didn't answer immediately. Instead, he flicked the syringe, drawing the liquid from the vial. "Morphine," he said finally. "It'll help with the pain. But it's not a fix." Carter eyed the needle warily. "And what happens when it wears off?" The medic's face remained impassive. "We'll deal with that later." Carter hesitated. He hated the idea of numbing himself when every instinct told him to stay sharp. But the truth was, he didn't have a choice. If he collapsed now, he was as good as dead. With a reluctant nod, he extended his arm. The medic wasted no time, administering the shot with practiced efficiency. Within seconds, a dull warmth spread through Carter's body, pushing back the searing pain. He exhaled, feeling some of the tension ease from his muscles. "We need to move," the medic said, standing. Carter pushed himself up, finding it easier than before. The pain was still there, but distant, like a memory. He glanced at the medic, something unreadable in his gaze. "Who are you, really?" Carter asked. The medic's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Instead, he turned and kept moving. Carter sighed and followed. Somewhere in the distance, the gunfire had stopped. A deep silence settled over the ruined city, thick with unanswered questions. The silence felt heavier than the gunfire. Carter's boots crunched softly against the debris-strewn pavement as he followed the medic deeper into the ruins. His mind buzzed with questions, but the only sound between them was the distant creaking of metal from bombed-out buildings shifting in the wind. The medic moved with purpose, his grip tight on his sidearm, his posture tense. He knew something Carter didn't. They turned a corner into a narrow passageway between two collapsed structures. Carter hesitated. Something felt off. The air was too still, the shadows too deep. Then, movement. A flash of metal caught his eye. A figure emerged from the wreckage ahead, rifle raised. Down. The medic hissed, shoving Carter hard against the crumbling wall. A burst of gunfire tore through the air, sending chunks of concrete flying where Carter had been standing a second before. The medic fired back, quick and controlled, forcing the attacker into cover. Carter, still reeling, reached for his own weapon, but his hand was sluggish. The morphine had dulled the pain, but also his reflexes. More movement. Two figures flanked from the side, shadows slipping through the rubble like ghosts. Carter's pulse pounded. This wasn't just a random scout. They were being hunted. The medic fired again, then grabbed Carter's arm, pulling him into a half-collapsed storefront. Dust billowed around them as they scrambled for cover behind an overturned counter. "They knew we were coming," Carter muttered. The medic's jaw tightened. "Stay down." Another burst of gunfire erupted outside, followed by a sharp whistle, some kind of signal. The enemy wasn't retreating. They were closing in. Carter's grip on his weapon tightened. "We're boxed in." The medic didn't respond immediately. He reached into his vest, pulled out a small cylindrical device, and handed it to Carter. A grenade. Carter glanced at him. "You expect me to throw this in my condition?" The medic's eyes remained locked on the doorway. "I expect you to follow my lead." Outside, footsteps crunched against broken glass. Low voices murmured in a language Carter didn't recognize. The shadows shifted again, this time closer. Carter exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the grenade. His vision was sharp now, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then, the medic moved. Fast. Precise. He popped up from cover, firing 2 clean shots. A cry rang out as one of the attackers dropped. The others reacted instantly, returning fire. Carter knew his window was small. He pulled the pin, counted 2 seconds, then hurled the grenade toward the door. The explosion rocked the building, sending a shockwave through the cramped space. Dust and debris rained down, the screams of the enemy muffled by the blast. But Carter didn't have time to celebrate. The medic grabbed his arm and yanked him to his feet. "Move." Still dizzy from the blast, Carter stumbled after him, his boots sliding across the wreckage. Behind them, smoke billowed from the ruined storefront. They ran, past shattered windows, through darkened alleys, every muscle in Carter's body screaming in protest. His pulse thundered in his ears. Then, just as they rounded another corner, the medic suddenly stopped. Carter barely had time to react before he saw why. A line of enemy soldiers stood at the end of the street, their rifles already raised. Carter's breath caught in his throat as he locked eyes with the soldiers blocking their escape. Their rifles were steady, their expressions unreadable in the dim light. The acrid scent of smoke and gunpowder lingered in the air. Behind them, the wreckage of the explosion still crackled, flames licking at the ruins. Carter and the medic were trapped. No cover, no time, no options. The enemy didn't fire immediately. Instead, one of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, took a slow step forward. His voice was calm, almost amused. "Looks like you ran out of road." Carter's grip on his rifle tightened. His pulse pounded in his ears. He had enough rounds left for a fight, but against this many? It would be suicide. The medic took a step closer to Carter, his voice low. "Follow my lead." Before Carter could question him, the medic slowly raised his hands, showing he wasn't holding his weapon. The enemy soldiers stiffened but didn't fire. Carter hesitated, his instincts screaming at him not to trust this. But what choice did he have? The man with the scar tilted his head. "Smart move. Now drop your weapons." Carter clenched his jaw. Surrender wasn't an option. But as he glanced at the medic, he saw something strange. His fingers were subtly tapping against his thigh in a rhythmic pattern. A signal. Carter swallowed, his mind racing. He had no idea what the medic was planning, but he had to play along. Gritting his teeth, he loosened his grip on his rifle, lowering it just slightly. The enemy leader smirked. "Good. Now kick it over." Before he could finish, the medic moved. In a single fluid motion, he dropped low, grabbed a handful of loose rubble, and flung it into the soldiers' faces. The distraction lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough. Carter reacted instantly, swinging his rifle up and firing. The first shot hit the scarred man in the shoulder, sending him stumbling back. The rest of the soldiers shouted, scrambling for cover. The medic was already moving, pulling Carter with him as they dashed toward a side alley. Bullets ripped through the air, ricocheting off walls and kicking up dust around them. Carter's body screamed in protest, but adrenaline kept him moving. They sprinted through the maze of ruined buildings, each turn bringing more uncertainty. The enemy wouldn't let them go easily. A sharp whistle cut through the night. Another signal. More soldiers were closing in. Carter barely had time to process before the medic suddenly shoved him against a crumbling wall, pressing a hand against his chest to keep him still. "Quiet," he whispered. Carter forced his breathing to slow, listening. Footsteps. Voices. Close. The medic's eyes darted to a narrow gap between two broken buildings. Without a word, he slipped inside, motioning for Carter to follow. Carter hesitated for half a second, then squeezed through, barely making it into the shadows before a group of soldiers rushed past the alley. They waited. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, silence. Carter exhaled shakily. "They're still looking for us." The medic nodded, his expression unreadable. "They won't stop." Carter met his gaze, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Then what's the plan?" The medic looked past him, scanning the ruins ahead. "We keep moving." Carter gritted his teeth. His wounds were throbbing, exhaustion creeping in, but he had no choice. With a deep breath, he followed the medic deeper into the unknown. The night stretched on, heavy with the scent of burning debris and distant gunfire. Carter and the medic moved in silence, their steps careful against the crumbling ground beneath them. Every corner they turned felt like a trap waiting to spring. Carter's body ached, his wounds a dull throb beneath the layer of grime and sweat coating his skin. But stopping wasn't an option, not with enemy soldiers scouring the area. The medic, always a step ahead, led the way, his movements swift but deliberate. He barely spoke, only giving brief gestures or low murmurs when necessary. Carter didn't like it. He was used to taking orders from his own men, not following some stranger he didn't trust. Yet, something about the medic's presence kept them alive. A distant shout rang out, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire. Both men froze. The sound had come from somewhere ahead. More soldiers. They were cutting off escape routes. Carter clenched his jaw. "We're running out of options." The medic scanned the buildings, his expression unreadable. "There's another way." Carter didn't like the sound of that. "What way?" The medic didn't answer right away. Instead, he pressed himself against the wall of a half-collapsed building, peeking around the corner. After a tense moment, he turned back to Carter. "There's a supply tunnel under one of these buildings," he said. "It should lead us outside their perimeter." Carter narrowed his eyes. "And you know this how?" The medic hesitated. A flicker of something crossed his face, something Carter couldn't quite place. It was gone just as quickly. "I just do," the medic said. Carter didn't like it. He didn't like any of this. But there was no time to argue. "Lead the way," he muttered. They moved fast, keeping to the shadows. Carter's grip tightened around his rifle as they approached the remains of an old warehouse, its metal frame bent and rusted. The medic slipped inside first, scanning for threats. Carter followed, his breath slow and controlled. The place was eerily quiet, dust hanging thick in the air. The medic crouched near a section of broken floorboards and pried them open with a grunt. Beneath was a dark tunnel, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. The air that seeped out was damp and stale. Carter exhaled sharply. "You sure about this?" The medic's expression hardened. "It's our best shot." Before Carter could protest, the medic dropped down, disappearing into the darkness. Carter cursed under his breath, glancing once toward the exit. The distant sound of approaching voices made the decision for him. He climbed down. The tunnel swallowed him whole. The tunnel seemed endless, the air thick with dust and the scent of damp earth. Carter's pulse pounded in his ears as he crawled forward, every inch feeling like a lifetime. The medic moved swiftly ahead, his breathing controlled, his presence steady despite the suffocating darkness. Then, just as Carter thought the passage would never end, a faint sliver of light appeared ahead. The medic reached it first, pushing aside an old wooden hatch and climbing out. Carter followed, emerging into the open air with a sharp inhale. The night was still alive with distant gunfire, but for now, they were safe. Carter rolled onto his back, staring at the sky, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The medic, kneeling beside him, checked his wounds. The hostility in Carter's eyes had faded, replaced by something he didn't want to name, something that looked too much like gratitude. "You good?" the medic asked. Carter let out a breath, nodding slowly. "Yeah." A silence stretched between them before Carter finally spoke again. "What's your name?" The medic hesitated, then exhaled as if releasing something long buried. "Jordan." Carter's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Jordan, you didn't have to come back for me." Jordan looked away for a moment, as if weighing his words. "I wasn't going to leave you behind. Not after everything." Carter swallowed. He had spent years building walls, clinging to his own biases without question. But now, lying here, saved by the very man he had dismissed, those walls felt weaker than ever. They sat in silence, the weight of the night settling between them. Finally, Jordan stood. "We should move. They'll be looking for us." Carter pushed himself up, his body aching but his mind clearer than it had been in a long time. He looked at Jordan with something close to respect. As they walked into the darkness, Carter knew he wasn't the same man who had doubted the medic just hours ago. He had been saved not just in body, but in perspective. Some lessons come too late. Others come just in time. The night swallowed them, but somewhere in the distance, the first light of dawn was beginning to rise. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us for more powerful stories that challenge perspectives and inspire change.